up in the top left-hand corner of your screen where you can raise your hand. Michelle's going to be the presenter today, and she'll be talking with you. And she might ask you to use that. We also will have feedback over in the left side, and you can either text back, write in a chat message in the public section on the bottom left as well. And that's where, if you have any questions or answers to Michelle's questions, you can write there. If you have any tech issues or anything that you need to address, you can message me in the private chat, and I will take care of that. My name is Alice Wolfkill, by the way. I'm the program assistant for the Stalking Resource Center. We're going to do a little test here and see who is participating today. So we'll test this feedback. And you can go ahead and choose if you're a college or university official, law enforcement, or a victim service provider. Please feel free to type in if you have a different profession in the public chat. Great. It looks like we have a few university officials. Wonderful. So it looks like we have about more than half of you are university officials, and we have some law enforcement and a few victim service providers. Great. So I'll pass it over to Michelle, and she can begin the webinar.
Thank you so much, Alice, and welcome everyone. We are very pleased to be holding this webinar in recognition of National Campus Safety Awareness Month, and pleased to have been working with the Clery Center for Security on Campus to promote National Campus Safety Awareness Month. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Stalking Resource Center, we are a nonprofit. We're a program of the National Center for Victims of Crime. We're based in Washington, D.C., and we're funded by the U.S. Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women to work with communities, organizations, colleges, and universities to enhance the ability to recognize and respond to stalking. And so we thank OVW for their generous continued support of the SRC and of our efforts. For our time together today, what we're going to look at is starting with a definition of stalking, just so we're all on the same page, looking at how common this is in our communities and our campuses, looking at the dynamics of stalking, including a little bit of time on the use of technology to stalk, since this is such an issue at colleges and universities, and then talking about our recommendations around what a campus response to stalking should look like. A copy of the PowerPoint will be made available to participants. We will send that in an email following the webinar, along with a link to an evaluation that we would ask if you would take a couple minutes just to complete. If at any time you have questions during the webinar, please feel free to use the chat feature to ask those questions, and if I don't address them throughout the webinar, we will get back to those at the end of the session. So where I'd actually like to start is looking at a definition of stalking. And this is because if we were to look at your campus policies or misconduct codes around stalking, or even if we look at the laws on stalking across the U.S., while there may be some commonalities, there might also be some differences. So we don't have one specific sort of legal or policy definition to use. So this is a definition that we use and that we recommend in terms of thinking about this as an issue, and that is that stalking is a pattern of behavior directed at a specific person that will cause a reasonable person to feel fear. Now, a few things about this definition. First of all, pattern of behavior. Obviously, we're talking about something that occurs more than once, that is repeated. And when we look at stalking as a behavior, what makes it distinct from other types of behaviors like, say, harassment, is this concept of fear or emotional distress. But fear is a challenging thing, and it's a really complex piece of this definition because fear itself is challenging. It is subjective. We are not all afraid of the same things. What might seem benign to me might be terrifying to you, and vice versa. So often what it really requires is for us to put ourselves in that victim's shoes and understand what those behaviors might mean to them. The other thing is, a lot of times people don't admit to being fearful, and we often see this with adolescents, young adults. this invincibility, I'm not afraid of anything, and I'm not going to let the offender win. There's not this admission of fear, even if sometimes there's behavior that might demonstrate fear. So you might have someone who is changing their routines, who's doing things to enhance their own safety and security, but at the same time, if you were to ask them if they were afraid, they might respond that they're not. And when we actually look at the research around victims' reactions to stalking, particularly when the stalking behavior first begins, so often what we hear victims saying is that they're anxious or concerned or angry or pissed off and not necessarily reporting fear, again, even if their actions might demonstrate fear. And those reactions are going to be different in different people. There's not one specific way that all of us respond to fear. When we look at this from a legal perspective as to what our laws say, where this can be challenging is sometimes the laws require that we actually have to prove that an offender intended to cause fear or cause emotional distress. And so often when you ask stalking offenders why they're doing what they do, they'll talk about because they're in love or they're trying to win someone's affection. Rarely do they admit that they're doing this just to cause fear. So really what we're left with is that when we look at stalking as a behavior, it's a really context-dependent behavior. Context is absolutely critical in these cases. And again, to really emphasize that we have to look at it from that victim's perspective, because what might be terrifying to them might not be harmful to us. And often, particularly when we're looking at stalking that's happening within the context of a pre-existing relationship, particularly a current or former intimate partner relationship, there may be behaviors that are only going to be understood to that victim, that are meaningful only between that victim and offender, something like a look or a gesture or a song that to an outside person has no meaning. The other interesting thing is that when we look at stalking behaviors, so often the behaviors that make up stalking individually may not be criminal behaviors, and we're going to come back to this point. What's really required is that when we look at stalking and we look at the behaviors that make up stalking, we have to look at them within that context that they're occurring, what the behaviors mean to the victim, and also within the full course of conduct. Because individually those non-criminal behaviors may not seem alarming. Someone receiving 50 text messages in 1 hour may not be strange or abnormal given the frequency of texting. But then when we look at how things like that fit in with other behaviors that victim is experiencing, acts like perhaps vandalism to a car or damage to property, or the offender showing up as the victim's new residence when the victim thought the offender didn't know where she or he had relocated, or threats that are posted on social media, when we take this all within the full course of conduct and look at it within that context, then we can go back to our original definition that is this a pattern of behavior that's directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. Now let's look at how common stalking is. Is this really an issue that's happening in our communities and our campuses? So using the feedback feature on the left side of your screen, I'd like you to choose how many people do you think are stalked in 1 year in the United States. Choose A if you believe it's 1.2 million, choose B if you believe it's 3.4 million, C if you believe it's 4.5 million, and D if you believe it's 6.6 million. All right, so we see our folks answering. All right, it looks like the majority of people are saying C, 80%. That 80% of respondents are saying it's 4.5 million. Well, what we know is that in a 1 year period, 6.6 million people were stalked in the United States. Now, how do we know this? Is this based on reports of stalking? No. We know that stalking, very similar to domestic violence, dating violence, sexual violence, is an underreported crime. This is actually based on research. In 2011, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention released a report called the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey, referred to as the NISVIS. And this was based on a national study that was done looking at intimate partner violence, sexual violence, and stalking. Even though stalking isn't in the name, it was one of the 3 types of crimes that the survey looked at. And what they found was that in a 1 year period, 6.6 million people had been stalked. Now what this breaks down to is a rate of about 26.5 people per 1,000. So if you wanted to do a statistical estimation of how many people are stalked in your community or your campus in 1 year, what you can do is take the population of your community or campus, divide by 1,000, and multiply by 26.5. And this again will give you that statistical baseline of stalking cases happening in 1 year in your community or campus. But this number is going to be an underestimate for our colleges and universities for a couple of reasons. First, when we look at the research, what we consistently find is that the rates of stalking among college students exceed the rates found in the general population. So at the start, we know the rates of stalking are higher on campuses. The other reason it'll be an underestimate is that when we look at the dynamics of stalking, when we look at adults, we know that young adults, 18 to 24-year-olds, experience the highest rates of stalking. And when we talk about traditional colleges and universities, we're talking about environments that have a concentration of 18 to 24-year-olds. So really that estimate, that 26.5 per 1,000, will be, I think, a low baseline, but it will give you an idea of how many cases are most likely occurring on your campus or your community in a 1 year period. When we further look at the dynamics of stalking, we know that women are more likely to experience stalking. They're nearly 3 times more likely to be stalked than males. Most of our offenders tend to be male. However, when we break that down by gender of the victim, what we know with our female victims is that overwhelmingly the offenders tend to be male. However, with our male victims, they're equally likely to be stalked by a male or a female. And in most cases, the victims and the offender are going to know each other in some capacity. They might be acquaintances, they could be classmates, neighbors, co-workers, it could be a family member. We have had cases of siblings stalking each other, of cousins stalking each other. But for most cases, what we'll see is that the victim and the offender are going to be current or former intimate partners. So boyfriend, girlfriend, partner, spouse, ex-boyfriend, ex-girlfriend, ex-partner, ex-spouse. And when we look at college campuses, some of what the research tells us is that there is this increased risk for victimization. And some of the elements that increase that risk for victimization include the propensity to be in places where there's alcohol, not that alcohol causes stalking, but the propensity to be in places with alcohol is an element that correlates with increased victimization. Living alone, being in a dating relationship, versus being in a committed relationship like being married or living with an intimate partner. And this makes sense when we think about it. It's most often that current or former intimate partner. If someone is dating, if they're ending those relationships, there is that increased risk. Being an undergraduate may correlate with this perception of naivete and vulnerability on the part of offenders. And then having experienced sexual victimization before the beginning or current academic year. And we'll talk a little bit more about the intersection between stalking and sexual assault. So in thinking about stalking behaviors, what stalking behaviors can you think of? Or what have you seen, or what have victims or offenders disclosed to you if you've done work around stalking cases? So use the chat box and go ahead and type in any stalking behaviors that you can think of. Either ones that you've witnessed, that you've had victims disclose to you, or have had offenders disclose to you. So go ahead and use the chat box. It should be either in the bottom or the left-hand side of your screen, and type in any stalking behaviors that you can think of. All right, so we see unwanted phone calls, showing up at the classes, the residence halls, texting, trying to access former current partners on social media. So we see a lot of social media being used, using GPS to track or follow someone or locate someone. Absolutely. These are all the types of behaviors that we commonly see in stalking cases. And when victims are asked what are the most common behaviors that they're experiencing, it's exactly these types of behaviors. So victims report unwanted phone calls, voicemails, messages, text messages. The offenders spreading rumors about them. They're sending unwanted letters or email. They're showing up places where the victim is at. They're waiting for the victim to show up at places. They're leaving unwanted gifts. They're engaging in following or spying. So these are all very common stalking behaviors, but what's also interesting is if we look at these behaviors individually, many of them, or most of them in fact, by themselves will not be criminal behaviors and most likely will not be violations of your policies or your codes of conduct. It's typically not illegal to make a phone call or to send a text message or even send 50 text messages, to show up in a public place or to be waiting for someone in a public venue, to send someone letters or gifts or presents. Most of these behaviors in and of themselves are not going to be criminal behaviors or violations of policies or codes of conduct, but it's when we start to see them in that pattern of behavior, that repeated behavior directed at a specific person that would cause that person or a reasonable person to feel that fear or emotional distress, then what we're talking about is stalking behavior. And what we start to see in here a little bit, but that we really need to pay attention to, is how offenders are also using technology. And this is really critical, I think, on college and university campuses, because our experience, at least these days, is that it is extremely rare for a stalking case not to involve some form of technology, even if it's just as simple as a cell phone, which is probably the most common form of technology we see used in stalking cases, whether it's to communicate or attempt to communicate, using email, social networking, using tracking, all sorts of different ways. And particularly with our colleges and universities, we're talking about populations who tend to be very tech proficient, who are using technology every day to communicate, to do schoolwork. And so this intersection with technology is a piece that we absolutely have to pay attention to and be aware of the many different technologies that our offenders are using. To that end, we'd actually like to show you a short video that addresses the use of technology by offenders. You should be able to click over to a tab on the top of your screen that says Tech Video Clip that will play a short video around the use of technology. If anyone had any challenges viewing the video, you can actually see that video, at least for the next day or two, on our YouTube site. The URL is posted in the chat. Also, to let people know, that clip that you saw is part of a 15-minute DVD on the use of technology to stalk that we've developed. This is a free resource. This is intended to be used to train any professionals who are working with stalking victims or offenders. If anyone would like a free copy of this video, we can send you one. All you need to do is go to our website, which is victimsofcrime.org/SRC, and you can request a free copy of this or multiple copies. Again, it's intended for professionals who are working with victims or offenders. It's not intended to show to students to raise awareness or for working with victims. It's really designed, again, for training purposes. We also have another resource around technology. We have an online training course on the use of technology to stalk, another free resource. The course takes about 60 to 90 minutes to complete. It's completely self-paced. You don't have to do it all in one sitting. It expands on some of the technologies you saw in the video and also offers considerations around evidence collection and documentation, as well as safety considerations for victims. There's also a certificate that's provided at the end of the course for anyone who passes a short quiz successfully, for anyone who could use that certificate for their own training or professional development purposes. Again, it's a free resource, and if you go to our website, you can register for that course. So obviously the technology piece is really critical when we start thinking about stalking. It's also important that we recognize that stalking does not happen in a vacuum, that it often intersects with other crimes like physical and sexual violence. So when we look at some of the research that's been done on campuses with college victims, specifically female victims of stalking, what they found was that the majority of women who had experienced stalking had also experienced other forms of victimization, whether it was sexual, physical, or both. So recognizing that we're often seeing these intersections between domestic violence, dating violence, sexual violence, and stalking on our campuses. And when we specifically look at that link between stalking and sexual assault, we know that sexual assault on campus is an issue for all colleges and universities, that the research now tells us that it's about a quarter to a fifth of women will experience an attempted or completed sexual assault during their college career. And in most cases of sexual assault, we know that victims and offenders know each other. And when we look again at that intersection between sexual assault and stalking, specifically on campuses, the research bears out that there is this connection. But what's interesting about the research is that the question has historically always been posed from the perspective of asking stalking victims, were you also sexually assaulted, rather than asking sexual assault victims, were you also stalked? And we've actually done quite a bit of work with Dr. David Lesak in looking at his work around what he calls the undetected rapists. So these are individuals who have committed sexual assaults, often serial assaults, who have never been held accountable. And in working with Dr. Lesak, one of the things that we look at is, can we look at the behaviors that precede these sexual assaults on college and university campuses as stalking behaviors? That these predators, particularly the serial offenders who are self-admitting to committing multiple sexual assaults, the type of grooming behaviors and pursuit behaviors and predatory behaviors that we see that include often watching someone, repeatedly communicating with someone, showing up places where this person is at, could we start thinking of those behaviors as stalking behaviors? And if we have perpetrators who are contacting victims after the assault repeatedly, whether it's to threaten them into silence or into recanting or to try and ascertain how they're thinking about what happened or whether they've told anyone or trying to shape how that victim is thinking about the incident, could those repeated contacts also be considered stalking? So we do encourage people to think broadly about this intersection between stalking and sexual assault. We also know that in stalking cases there is risks of other types of harm and other types of violence. So frequently we will see things like property damage. The offender will damage that victim's property or someone else's property. Vandalism to a car is one of the most common forms of property damage we see in stalking cases, so particularly when we're talking to law enforcement, first responders, we encourage them that anytime they're responding to a report of damage to a car, that they ask a few additional questions about other behaviors this person might have been experiencing to see if maybe this is a stalking case. In a little more than 1 out of 5 cases, we see a direct attack by the stalker on the victim. And often we see that the offenders will also attack or target other people around that victim, whether it's another person or a pet. And our intimate partner stalkers are more likely to assault third parties than the non-intimate partner stalkers. We also know there is a risk of violence in stalking cases. So when we look across the research, what we find is that anywhere from about 25 to 35% of stalking cases do involve other types of violence, physical aggression, punching, kicking, pushing, using weapons. If we take those rates and if we apply those to the numbers that we have from the NIST, so the 6.6 million people stalked in 1 year, the 1 in 6 women and 1 in 19 men stalked in their lifetime, what we find is that 2 to over 2 million women and 500,000 to nearly 1 million men in their lifetime experience some type of stalking-related violence. And when we look at serious violence, up to and including homicide, we're looking at 140,000 women and 40,000 men may suffer serious stalking-related violence. So we know that these are cases we have to take seriously because they often escalate, and they often escalate into much more significant harm and damage to that victim, to other people, and up to and including often homicide, or sometimes what we see is the homicide-suicide. So in thinking about stalking, we know there's challenges in responding to this as a crime, as a behavior, that it's a complex and dynamic crime, that it can often be difficult to identify. Taking all of that, are there additional challenges that are unique to colleges and universities? So I'm asking you, so please use the chat feature. What unique challenges do colleges and universities face in addressing stalking? So using the chat feature at the bottom or to the left of your screen, go ahead and type in any unique challenges that you can think of that colleges and universities face in addressing stalking. Okay, you might have a perpetrator and a victim who are in the same class or live in the same residence hall, looking at perhaps different definitions between the Student Code of Conduct and the criminal justice system, lack of clear policies or protocols for law enforcement or for any officials within the university, access, difficulty in terms of keeping track of who enters classrooms, residence halls, any other part of campus. Yeah, absolutely. These are some of the difficulties that we have seen and we have heard from the campuses that we've worked with across the country. In addition to these, some of the ones that we also see are the access pieces. So campuses are often, regardless of how large of a college or university it is to some degree a closed environment, and people often have access to each other's information and repeatedly see folks in the same places, that there's routines, and so people have access to that information about people's routines, their courses, where they're going to be every Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 1 o'clock. So there's that access piece. There may be limits on safety accommodation. So if you do have a victim and offender who do share the same class, and one of them needs to move, is that even possible? If it's the only section of the last class that both of them need to graduate, what accommodations can be made? If they live in the same residence hall or on the same floor, what accommodations can be made, if any, to separate them? So looking at what accommodations are there, and are there any constraints on those accommodations? Jurisdictional issues we see when you have students who are victims or faculty who are victims who may be reporting stalking victimization, but it's occurring in a lot of places because we know offenders don't stay within a geographic boundary. So you may have a victim who's reporting to campus security and campus police, but they're also reporting to the local law enforcement when something's happening in town. Or if it's a student who goes home for spring break who's being contacted, or the offender shows up back in their hometown, they're reporting to the police in their hometown. And so now you have behaviors that are happening in all these different jurisdictions. And how are those jurisdictions communicating with each other? How is this information being shared, if it's being shared at all? That often the folks who are hearing these cases, whether on the discipline committee or the misconduct hearing boards may not have any specific training around stalking and recognizing it and recognizing the risk and the seriousness of it. And related to that is often this belief that stalking is not that big of a deal. And part of that is because stalking is socially normalized. And this is not unique to colleges and universities, but I think it is a particular challenge to colleges and universities because we're often talking about populations that are massive consumers of media, of popular culture, and when we look at the messages that around stalking that are embedded in our media and our popular culture, they tend not to be messages that say stalking is a serious crime that has a great risk for the victims and for our communities and we should do something to take it seriously. Rather, the messages tend to minimize stalking. So when we look at some of these messages, we can look to media like our music. So probably the prime example of stalking songs is the Police's song, Every Breath You Take. The lyrics, every breath you take, every move you make, I'll be watching you. Sting has actually said in interviews that he has written this as a dark, creepy stalking song, but that people often perceive it as romantic, and that he's gotten fan mail from folks who say, we love this song, it's such a beautiful song, this was our wedding song. And so taking in these messages that say stalking is a romantic behavior, and it's not unique to one band. We can look across genres and we can find music that either out and out promotes stalking or romanticizes stalking or minimizes stalking in some way. So it's in our music, it's in our movies. There are dozens to hundreds of movies that have stalking as an entertainment plot line, and often when they do, they treat it as romantic or they treat it as funny, as comedic, as a joke. And so the messages that we're getting about stalking, again, minimize it. We also see stalking used commercially. So if any of you do a search for stalking t-shirts, so Google or Bing stalking t-shirts, you will find hundreds of examples of shirts that have messages around stalking like, some call it stalking, I call it love. So again, saying that stalking's not a big deal, that it's not serious, that it's romantic. We also see this intersection with the technology, and again, very humorously, I gave up Facebook stalking my boyfriend's ex for Lent, so this is a very normal behavior. Another example of the commercialization, this was a greeting card that was for sale last year for Valentine's Day. It was available across the country in stores like Target and Wegmans. Stalker is a harsh word, I prefer Valentine. So I do think this social normalization piece is one of our biggest challenges in recognizing and responding to stalking, that there's this misconception of what it is, there's a misconception of the seriousness of it, and we often hear that victims themselves are minimizing it because all these messages they get are that stalking is not a big deal, so when they're actually experiencing it, they minimize it, they minimize the risk, and they may not report because they think this is not a big deal. So I do think that social normalization is one of our biggest challenges. And in fact, when we look at the effect of all of this on victims, we do see a broad range of effects that many victims will talk about changes in eating habits, sleeping habits, difficulty concentrating, which in the grand scheme of effects, potential effects may not seem like the biggest one, but again, if we're thinking about students who are trying to be academically successful, difficulty concentrating may have a significant impact. Victims will develop depression, post-traumatic stress disorder. Increased anxiety is extremely common in stalking victims, and it makes sense. If someone is experiencing these types of repeated behaviors, it makes sense that they're going to become more anxious. Many victims become hyper-anxious or hyper-vigilant, always being on guard. When campus stalking victims were asked about their specific responses, what we saw is that nearly half took steps to try and avoid the stalker. So they themselves were engaging in efforts to not have contact with that offender. Some actually confronted the stalker, and we don't recommend this. What we actually recommend is that victims completely disengage from the stalker, that they have no contact. And part of the reason for this is that with stalkers, any contact can reinforce their behavior, even negative contact. So if I'm a stalker and I call my victim 100 times over the course of a day, and 100 times that victim lets it go to voicemail, and on the 101st time they're so sick of me calling, they pick up and answer and say, stop calling me and hang up, I'm going to call at least 101 times the next day because it took 101 times to hear their voice. It took 101 times for me in my mind to hear them say essentially how much they care about me because they answered my call. So any contact, even negative contact, can reinforce the stalker's behavior, which is why we strongly recommend disengagement. Now we know there's some challenges around this. Again, when we're talking about this closed community like a college or university, it may be difficult to completely separate. And so what we want to make sure in those cases is that if any type of contact happens, that there's safety planning around that. Taking steps to, again, not acknowledge the offender, using strategies like caller ID to try and not have to take the offender's calls or messages, engaging in steps to improve their own security, traveling with a friend, using civil systems, so getting something like a protection order, a restraining order, and then using the university systems that are in place, whether it's filing a report or seeking counseling services either on campus or in the community. And when we look at how often stalking victims report, I mentioned earlier that like domestic violence and sexual assault, stalking tends to be underreported. When we look at college victims, what we find is that the overwhelming majority were not reported to campus police or campus law enforcement, but most victims did tell someone else. Most commonly it was a friend, but it could also be an RA, a trusted faculty member, or staff member. So it highlights how critical it is that we're providing this information and training to the folks who victims might turn to, so to their peers, to RAs, to those individuals on campus that a victim might actually report to, because in most incidents it's not going to be campus security or campus law enforcement. And the reasons for not reporting are varied. One of the most common ones that we see is that minimization. Again, they didn't think that the incident was serious enough. And if all the messages that they're getting from the media, from their peers, is that this is not a big deal, it's so easy to minimize this behavior. For nearly half, they didn't know it was a crime, and that also makes sense, that if we go back and think about the fact that most of these behaviors individually are not crimes, it's not unusual for us to hear a victim say, well, yeah, my ex is texting me repeatedly, but it's not a crime to send a text message. Or, yeah, they show up in the dining hall when I'm there, but they can eat in that dining hall, so that's not necessarily a crime. Didn't think law enforcement would take it seriously, thought they lacked proof, feared reprisals, both from the offender, but often because victims and offenders may be part of the same social network or peer group, that there's also this concern of reprisals from within their own social networks for getting a friend or getting someone they know in trouble. Not knowing how to report the incident, which I think may be one of the easiest ones to address, about getting information out there about resources and how to report, and not wanting other people to know, whether it's their friends, but often the primary concern we hear from students is not wanting their parents to find out. So there's a lot of different reasons why victims choose not to report. So in thinking about this, when campuses are looking at the issue of stalking, what should that response include? And while this is going to vary from campus to campus, we do have some basic elements that we recommend should be part of any campus response to stalking. These include educational programming, services and resources for victims, training for officials, and then having policies and protocols in place. Starting with educational programming, we really break that into two different types. The first is awareness, so increasing awareness about what stalking is, the realities of stalking. So ways to do this can include adding information to orientation materials, using one of the designated violence awareness months. So January is National Stalking Awareness Month. February is Dating Violence Prevention and Intervention Month. So often because we see these intersections, we can build stalking into the activities around those. April, Sexual Assault Awareness Month. October, Domestic Violence Awareness Month. I'll talk in a minute about some resources for Stalking Awareness Month. And then getting information out there where victims might see it or where anyone might see it. So online, in the residence halls, health center, counseling center, classrooms, libraries, really anywhere, everywhere that someone might encounter the information. To raise awareness, it's not something that's schools have to take on their own. We've got lots of different resources to help with this. We have media that you can download from our website to use, posters, buttons, magnets, that really take on the minimization piece, that really stress a message that it's not a joke, it's not romantic, and that it's not acceptable behavior. So all of these are available on our website. And as I mentioned, January is National Stalking Awareness Month. Since 2004, we have observed January as National Stalking Awareness Month. It's a great time to engage in activities on your campus or in your community to raise awareness. And in order to facilitate that, there's actually lots of resources that we've developed that are all available for free on the Stalking Awareness Month website, which is stalkingawarenessmonth.org. So there are posters, there's artwork, there's PSAs, there's table tents, there's all sorts of different materials that are free to use, to take, and most of them also have spaces for any of the media where you can add your own community or campus-specific resource information onto those. So I do encourage you to think about engaging activities for Stalking Awareness Month this coming January, and to check out the Stalking Awareness Month website for resources to be able to assist with that. There are also lots of colleges and universities who have developed their own campaigns to address sexual violence, domestic violence, and stalking on campus. One example, the University of New Hampshire, their Know Your Power, Step In, Speak Up campaign has been a very successful campaign, has actually been researched and evaluated, and they address stalking in this as well. And so looking at the messages in terms of awareness and prevention campaigns that we can put out to raise awareness about this issue on our campuses. So no need to recreate the wheel. There's already some great ones out there. Another one, Virginia Tech University, has this Trust Your Instincts campaign. If it doesn't feel right, it isn't. And then pointing people to where they can get additional resources around sexual assault, relationship violence, stalking on their campus. So lots of different resources that are already out there. No need to, again, have to recreate that wheel. In terms of prevention programming, there are several things that we do highlight. One is, as someone who actually started out doing this work as a peer educator when I was an undergrad, and the conversations that I've then had in working with schools, both pre-secondary and post-secondary, that I do believe that if we start having conversations about healthy relationships in an age-appropriate way at very young ages, I do think we will start to see a decrease in things like sexual violence, dating violence, and stalking. That so many of the messages that are out there don't address what is a healthy relationship, what are appropriate and inappropriate behaviors, what are healthy boundaries, and also what is a healthy breakup. And so really teaching healthy relationships, unnormalizing that stalking behavior, so really countering some of those messages that we get in popular culture and in media about what stalking is, and that it's romantic and that it's a joke. And then promoting bystander intervention. We've seen great success in the past decade with bystander intervention as a prevention tool specifically around sexual violence, and there's been a great body of research developed around this. I think intervention in stalking and prevention with stalking is ripe for a bystander intervention approach. Because so much of stalking behavior is often witnessed by other people, either by the victim experiencing it or by the offender engaging in it, I do think that we could really use this bystander intervention model to start addressing stalking in our communities and on our campuses. In terms of victim services, asking the question for your campus or your community, where would a victim go for services? Are there specific resources for stalking victims on your campus or in the community? And how would someone who is a victim know where to go? One of the questions whenever I go on to a college or university to do work around stalking is I look at the websites and how many clicks does someone have to go through to get to the information about where they could go for resources. So how down in your website is this information, or how easily accessible is it to someone who is a victim? That we're providing training. So training for campus officials or for anyone who a victim might turn to, and that we're thinking very broadly about this. So obviously for law enforcement, campus security folks, but again, we know that most victims are not going to report to campus law enforcement. So folks in housing, administrators, the counseling center, health center, your campus advocates or peer educators, faculty, advisors, the information technology folks, because so much of this is often technology-based and may be using university-based technology, that the IT people on your campus may actually be seeing some of this without being aware of what it is they're actually seeing. So really thinking broadly about who are the campus officials that we're training and that we're providing access to this information. And that training includes information around what stalking is, the dynamics, how to recognize it. That particularly for our law enforcement, that we're also talking about threat assessment in stalking cases. I talked about how there is this very real risk for additional harm, for violence, up to and including homicide. And so how do we do threat assessment in these stalking cases? And what's been very helpful is there's this growing body of resources and literature around threat assessment for college campuses. And we do have specific resources around threat assessment for intimate partner violence and some degree to stalking. And so if anyone is interested in more information around threat assessment around intimate partner violence or stalking, please don't hesitate to contact the Stalking Resource Center and we can provide additional information. We, on our website in our training section, actually have a webinar recording around a session that we did with Dr. Carl Roberts around stalking threat assessment and a new tool that we're in the process of piloting here in the U.S. to do specific stalking threat assessment. So if anyone's interested in that, you can check that out on our website. That folks are trained in how to do safety planning, so how to work with victims to identify concrete strategies to enhance their safety, that people on campus are aware of the community resources that are available, and vice versa, and really how do we collaborate. Stalking is such a complex and dynamic crime that no one person, no one department, no one office or agency can handle all of the complexities associated with these crimes, all of the needs of victims, all of the considerations around holding offenders accountable, that there really has to be collaboration amongst departments, divisions, and between campuses and community officials as well. We also think it's really critical that colleges and universities have an actual policy that articulates stalking. We have developed a model stalking campus policy, and our incentive around that is that we really recommend that a policy be in place because it does multiple things. It's one of the best ways to address that it's a problem. It names the problem for what it is, and it also demonstrates an institutional commitment to the issue that your campus takes this seriously and that they will respond seriously and appropriately to this crime. The other thing to incentivize schools to have a policy and protocol are twofold. First, with the changes to the within the Violence Against Women Act of 2013, the Campus Save Act now adds stalking to the Clery Act. And so for any school receiving federal financial aid funds, it will require them to include stalking in their collection of and reporting of data, having a policy in place for responding, having educational programming in place around stalking. And so all schools that receive federal financial aid funding are going to have to address stalking. Also, stalking can be a Title IX violation, that in our conversations with folks at the Department of Education, OCR, they talk about sexually motivated stalking is covered under Title IX. And while each case is going to be an individual determination, is there some evidence of gender or sexual basis to the conduct, and if so, it is a Title IX violation. So it is critical that schools have these policies and protocols in place. Like I said, we had developed and published a few years ago a model campus stalking policy. This is intended not as a one-size-fits-all for all colleges and universities. It's very much designed as a menu, that we have our recommendations about what should be included in campus policies, but it also allows universities to pull what will work best for them. We are going to be in the process of updating this to reflect the changes that are included in the Campus Save Act with the new requirements under VAWA 2013. But even while we're in that process, for schools that are looking to either implement or update their campus stalking policy, this is a great resource. It's available for free on our website. And we're also happy to do individual consultation with schools to review your policies, make recommendations around enhancements or changes, and work with you through that process. I already mentioned January's National Stalking Awareness Month. Again, it's a great resource for the work that you can do on your campus. I want to leave you with just a few additional resources. While at the Stalking Resource Center, we don't work directly with victims, we do have lots of resources for victims available on our website. And so these are places that victims can go to get more information around stalking, around safety planning around stalking. There are also resources that if you're working with victims, you can pull off of the website and you can distribute to victims as well. We have brochures that we're happy to send mass copies to your university, so you don't have to create your own brochure. And again, there's a space where you can add your own pertinent office or division information as the local resource. There's also an app called Campus Sentinel that has been developed by Margolis and Healy that provides campus safety and security information, including resources on stalking and information on stalking. And so this is, again, it's a free app. I'm not sure if they yet have an Android version, but I know they have an iTunes version. And the developers of this, Margolis and Healy, were recently awarded the funding to open the National Center on Campus Public Safety. And so that'll be a new national resource for colleges and universities around all issues addressing campus public safety. And we're very pleased that we have a partnership with Margolis and Healy, and we'll be working on the stalking components of that as well. The Clery Center, who, again, we want to acknowledge for their work, particularly in this month and promoting National Campus Safety Awareness Month. They are a tremendous resource for colleges and universities, and we, again, appreciate this opportunity to partner with them. And then lastly, the Stalking Resource Center. It is your continued source for assistance, resources, information, training. About a quarter of what we do is travel to colleges and universities providing training around stalking. And so we would be happy to come to your school or to work with you on your policies and protocols. So with that, we have about a minute left, so I just want to open it to any questions that folks might still have, that they can use the chat feature to ask any questions. All right, and if folks think of any questions afterwards, please don't hesitate to go ahead and send us an email. Our email address for just general inquiries, I'm typing into the chat box right now. It's src@ncvc.org, and my email address is mgarcia@ncvc.org, so you have both of those. We will also be making a recording of this webinar available on our website, probably within a week or so. And again, we will send out copies of the PowerPoint in an email following the webinar, along with a link for an evaluation. So I'd like to thank you so much for taking your time this afternoon to join us for this webinar, and appreciate any of the work that you might have been doing in recognition of National Campus Safety Awareness Month. And please don't hesitate to contact us if you need any additional information or resources. And with that, our webinar will conclude. Thank you all so much. Have a great day.